Hello and welcome to this video about Niagara's RDBMS Driver. This video is presented by Lynxspring, and thank you for watching. Let's talk about the RDBMS Driver in Niagara. It's pretty easy to use. It's a driver that allows you to have access to a database. You can use it to put data into a database, such as histories or alarms, and you can use it to pull data out of a database and bring points into your station from the database. So a lot to cover here, so let's just go ahead and get started. Probably a good idea before we start to familiarize you with our starting situation. First of all, I have a brand new blank station. I haven't done a thing to this station. I wanted to show you right from scratch. And we are going to be connecting to a database. Let me pull that database up so you get a look at it too. We have this database called Niagara Sample DB. It is also a brand new blank database with one, or actually two exceptions. Number one, I have a table that I've already created called table containing data to pass, so you wouldn't have to, I wouldn't have to have you watch me bore you to death while I create this table. It really just has ID, a date stamp, and some text that you can pass back. And other than that, I also have created a user called Niagara User that has access to this database. In fact, that Niagara User is the database owner in this case, but it doesn't have to be. You can just give it the permissions that you want. Work with your database administrator to make sure they have access to the correct database, and they also have access to the tables. In this case, I gave them specific access to this table containing data to pass. So now that we have a user who has access to the database, and we have a brand new blank station, let's go ahead and get started. All right, the RDBMS driver is a driver that you place under config, and then in drivers here, notice that I'm using the RDB SQL Server driver. In our case, because our database was SQL Server, then we want to be sure to choose the SQL Server driver. Niagara does make available a DB2 driver, a MySQL driver, an Oracle driver, and some others. In our case, we're going to use the RDBMS network driver. I'm sorry, the SQL Server database driver. First, we have to add the RDBMS network, though, to the driver's container, and we'll just leave it as RDBMS network. And sure enough, there it is. We'll right-click it so you can view its properties. Not a whole lot going on here. It is there, it's running, it's okay. It is enabled. That's one of your troubleshooting techniques, is to make sure that everything's enabled. In this case, it is. And nothing too hard about that. In order to, we've got the database network here, but we haven't told it anything about how to connect to the database, and we do that with the SQL Server database driver, and we'll drop that in the RDBMS network. Now here's another of your troubleshooting techniques. Make sure you have it configured so that under drivers you have the RDBMS network, and under that you have the SQL Server database. Let's right-click it and take a look at its properties. Okay, this is the actual information you fill in to connect to the database. And you can tell right now that the status is down because we haven't told it how to get there yet. The enabled is true. Again, double check to make sure everything is enabled that you want. In this case, to connect to a host address, we're going to use the IP of the server. Now, I happen to know the IP of the server. It's my server, but in case you don't, there's an easy way to find out if you know the name of the server. Just start a command prompt and go to ping, or type in ping, and then the name of the server. Mine is called Lynx SQLA. And sure enough, it's pinging and it's returning the IP address. Now, here's another one of your troubleshooting techniques, is to make sure that you're on a network that has an IP connection to the server. So you should go in and actually ping the server to make, whether you're pinging the name or pinging the IP address itself, to make sure that you're getting some kind of a connection. Obviously, you can't connect unless you're on the same IP network. So the IP address of this one is 10.2.1.55. So we'll want to remember that, and we'll plug that in here. 10.2.1.55. And the username now this is the username for the database. Niagara User, and the password for the database. Remember, this is not the same username and password that you use to get into the platform or to get into the station necessarily. This is specifically for the database. Okay. A couple of other things that are in here that are interesting. The worker. This is something you can do to help tune how well the database works. increase the number of threads so it can talk over more than one thread, or it can increase the queue size so it can send more data back and forth. Most people find these are okay, but if you're working with large databases or need really lightning fast, time coming back from your database, then you can adjust those in a tuning methodology. Export mode refers to histories. Remember, one of the things we said we wanted to do with the RDBMS driver was to store histories in SQL Server. Well, it wants to know what export mode you want to use. Do you want every history, that is every unique ID, to have its own table in the database? Or do you want every type of history to have its own table, but all the histories themselves are lumped in together? For example, all of the numeric change of values could be lumped into one table regardless of where they came from. So the default is by history ID, so every time I make a new history and then export it, it will create its own new table. Points is a container that is simply a part of any of the database connectors. It was added some time ago, and it doesn't require any configuration. SQL scheme enabled. If your goal is to draw information from the database and bring it into your station as a point, then you want to enable the SQL scheme. This allows Niagara to read the data, or read the tables and pull information, the scheme of the tables, and be able to find the field and pull information in. Here's another troubleshooting technique for you. If you find that you're able to export histories and you're able to export alarms, but for some reason you can't draw data from the database into your station, then chances are that you need to turn on this SQL scheme enabled. Okay, the instance name of this database, we'll double check it again, was Niagara Sample DB. Port number, by default, SQL Server generally runs on port 1433. However, from a security standpoint, your network administrator or your database administrator may have changed this port. If you find you can ping it but you can't connect to it, chances are you're not using the right port, so double check that with your network administrator. Okay, so that's pretty much all the settings you need for this to work, so we'll save it. Now, how do we know it's working? Still says it's down. Well, what you do is you go to the SQL Server database, you right-click, do an action of ping. And sure enough, it's okay as of this date and time, so we know we're making a connection. That's really all there is to connecting to a SQL Server database, is to add the RDBMS network under drivers, add the SQL Server database under RDBMS network, and then configure it. Pretty straightforward. So what can you do with it now that you've got the connection? Well, one of the things we talked about already was histories. Let's create a history, and then we'll show you how to put it in the database. So to start with, let's just create a new folder to contain a point. We'll call it sample. Okay, there's our new folder, and let's create a new numeric writable to pretend like it's the temperature. We'll call it temp. And so that the temperature can look like it's actually doing something, let's use a ramp. So we'll go to util here, under kit control, and we'll grab ourselves a ramp, and we'll stick it out there. And we won't change any of the defaults. It's I think it's every 30 seconds it ramps up and down through 100. Okay, so now we've got that tied in, and it looks like the temperature is going up and down. Okay, to create a history in SQL Server or in any of the databases, you first need to create the history just as you would normally on the point. So let's do that. So we'll open up temp. We will grab our history, open the extensions here, and let's do a numeric change of value. Anytime this number changes to a new value, we want to put that in histories. Not a whole lot to configure here other than to enable it. And then it'll run all those dates and times. That's great, so we'll save it. All right, so what we've done here is to create a history in our temp point. That by itself is working for Niagara internally on the station, but we haven't really told it to go to the database yet. To do that is very simple. What you do is go to your SQL Server database driver, and you open it up, and notice it has several containers under it. The one we care about right now is histories, so we'll double-click that. We'll discover any histories that are already in the station. And we'll open that up, and sure enough, there's our temp history, and we'll just double click it to add it to the system, or to the database system. You can change its name, you can change its ID, you can change the frequency of it. Since we're doing a demo here, I'll go ahead and make it a very short interval, make it an interval of 10 seconds. So every 10 seconds this is going to do an export. And it is enabled. So tell it OK. And sure enough, there's the history being exported to SQL Server. Let's go take a look at SQL Server and see what's changed. In SQL Server, it doesn't automatically show up, so you'll have to refresh it. And there you are. So it makes a little configuration table to keep track of all the histories that are here, but then it makes a table for each individual history point. Name of the station, RDBMS example, underscore, name of the point. If we right-click that, return all its rows, there's your changes of value. As we scroll down here, we can look. The last number is 74. It happened just a little while ago. ID number 74. But if I close that, wait a couple seconds here. Open the table, return all rows again. That should have given it time. Sure enough. Okay, so 75s and so on. All right, so that's how easy it is to put histories inside SQL Server, and you can do that over and over again with each one. There is one important point about this, though, and that is, I think we alluded to it before, the history that you created in your station is still there. And it still works just like any Niagara station history. It's just that by also adding that history to the SQL Server database histories, it also then exports it to SQL Server. So you haven't replaced anything, you're just exporting a copy. Contrast that with what we're about to do, which is the alarm service. Now, we said that you could use alarms and use the SQL Server database for your alarm database. And you can do that. It's very easy to do. The only difference being that this will replace the alarm service in your station. So you'll no longer have the standard Niagara alarm service. Instead, it'll be just taking the alarms and putting them up in the SQL Server database. And let me show you how to do that. First of all, it's probably worth noting that if we look at services, you can see that we have our standard alarm service. And if you look at that alarm service, it has a default alarm class. Well, the one that works for the database is Alarm RDB. Alarm RDB is another alarm service, and it also has its own default alarm class. So what we'll do is take that and drop it on services. We'll leave it named that. That's okay. And you can see then that it's added, and so too has its default alarm class been. Can't have them both, but if you have a bunch of alarms that are already under your alarm service, it's perfectly acceptable to copy them and paste them in down here before you delete the alarm service. But we will have to delete it, so we'll right-click and hit delete, and we're out of there. Okay, the alarm service, let's look at its property sheet. And there's not a whole lot to do here except for you have to tell it which driver to use. Remember the drivers we were talking about down here. Which driver to use in order to send the alarms up. Okay, so we'll tell the SQL Server database driver, and we'll save that. Okay, that has added the alarm service, so then let's add an alarm to our point, our temp point, and watch how that happens. I'll close this numeric change of value, and we'll go and add an alarm. And let's say that, let's do an out-of-range alarm. Let's say that every time, we'll just leave it called out-of-range alarm. Let's say that every time this out temperature gets to 85 or above, we want an alarm. Okay, so let's open that up. We will notice it's going to the default alarm class, which is now referring to this default alarm class. So let's set up the algorithm for off normal. We'll say that that's every time the high limit is 85, we can say the temp is above 85, and we'll enable that high limit to the default alarm class and save it. All right, so let's go see what happened to the database. Click in here. Again, we'll right click and tell it to refresh. Okay, Here is another troubleshooting technique for using alarms. And that is that for some reason, sometimes when you create an alarm, it doesn't automatically create the tables when you enable that alarm service. So one of the ways to ensure that this happens is we'll go back and restart our station. So let's go back up here to Platform, Application Director. And notice, see, it's complaining here about the alarm database is not open. Well, it actually is, and everything's configured correctly. So let's just restart the station here. Take us a second. Okay, our station has started. That error message about alarm should have gone away. And if we go back over here and now refresh the tables, there's our alarm record. And there's our first alarm. Okay. So again, the most important part about this in terms of how it relates to histories is that, again, I'll say it, histories still remain in the station and are copied to the database. The alarm service replaces the alarm service that's already in the database, or it's already in the station. Okay, also under the SQL Server database we have points that we can look at, and if we double click that, there aren't any. Okay, but in this case, let's say that we want some points. Let's talk about the points again, just to make sure. Here's our table of data to export. Return all rows. Table containing data to pass is what its name is. It has an ID, it has a date stamp, and it's just some text that we can pick up out of there. Okay, and its name, just to remember, is table containing data to pass. All right. So in order to let's go back to our station, and let's say we want to get some points here. So let's say we double-clicked our points, and then we'll say we want a new point. It says, okay, which type of point do you want to add? Well, we want to add a query point, and we just want one. So we're going to write a query that will go to the database and get the information out. We'll just write one of them here. Tell it okay. All right, so it says, what's the name of the query? Let's say info from table. And I have a sample of the query over here rather than heck you watch me type it all. I'll paste that in there. Essentially it says select star from the user DBO and the table containing data to pass. Pretty simple query. Key column wants to know which field within the data contains the key. Well, if you remember from looking back over here, the name of that key field is ID. All right, so we'll say its name is ID. And how often does it update? Let's make it also update every 10 seconds. Again, this is awfully fast. You don't want to be hitting your database that fast, but we're just doing information here for, we're just doing a sample. So okay. So now if we open up that query and tell it to discover any points, sure enough, it's able to go and read the database, find any information that's in there, and we can then tell it by clicking on a row. I'm going to click on row 2 here and double click it. It says, okay, you want to add that information, and its name is going to be, let's say, second row, and we're going to pull this my text, so it'll be a string point, and the value column that contains it is my text. Okay, tell it okay, and now we have a point, and if you look over here, we do in fact have a point second row. Okay, there is a little nuance here that's worth noting, and that's pretty straightforward, just like you might pull in any other kind of information. But let's take a look at the database and see how that might manifest itself. So I'm going to change test2 here to this is a test. And then we'll flip back over here, and we said it should update every 10 seconds, and there it is. This is a test, and that's okay. Perfect. Maybe exactly what you want. A good use case here would be if maybe this table contained a list of buildings, and this column was the name of the building, or the name of the building manager, or the temperature at the building at this time. Okay? So what we said was that anytime the value that's on the row whose ID is 2 changes, then we want to pull that information into the database, or into the station. Okay? But doesn't address row 3, or it doesn't address this field, or whatever. Suppose that I want to get the information, the most recent information from the table. I can write a query that allows me to pull that information. And I want to show you this because it's just a slight nuance that may be helpful to you. So let's say that we want let's go to points again here, and we'll make a new point. It's also going to be a point query. And in this case, another query I'm copying over here. This query essentially says, I won't bore you with the details, but it says select all that same information. It says select star, which means all the information from here, and it interjoins based on what is the max date in the table. And essentially what I'm asking for here is I want the most recent value, the most current row in the table. It's still the same table, so the key value is ID, and let's update it then every 10 seconds. Tell it OK. All right, and so we'll discover the points, and sure enough, remember from looking at our table that the most recent row is 4, and it contains the value test 4. Okay, so let's add that, and we'll say its name is most recent value, and the value column is going to be my text. Excellent. Pay attention to this key value 1 column because it's going to be important here. Key value 1, the first key that is, refers to the ID number 4. Incidentally, notice that our point is here. Okay. Now let's say we go back to the table and we'll add test 5. Okay. So now the new ID is 5. And the latest row contains test 5 as its data. If we come back over here, notice that my point is in fault. And the problem is that we told it to look for the value that was in key column. The first key value is in column whose ID is 4. Well, if we discover when we discovered points, the ID that it passed back this time was 5, and we told Niagara to look for the value that's in key column 4. Well, there is no key. I'm sorry, there is no ID number 4 in this row, so it's going to go into fault. So the problem here is in the way we wrote the query. Because we're telling it that the key value is whatever's in that ID field, then whenever that changes, then it's going to throw this off. So we can rewrite the query. Let me go into Views and go into the Query view. And here's the query. It says select table containing data to pass dot star. Instead, why don't we refer to the fields exactly as they're named? And instead of pulling the ID field, let's say select 1 as ID. DBO table to pass date stamp as date stamp, and DBO table to pass dot my text as my text. I think I got those field names right. ID, date stamp, my text. Okay, good. So now if we run that query, we get the same result, but instead of pulling the ID from the ID field, we said just use 1 as the ID all the time. regardless of what the ID might be. We just said use 1 as ID. So let's save that query now. Go back in here. And if we discover points, then we still have the latest row because we said to use date stamp and my text, but we always have the value 1. So let's get rid of this dude here. And instead, let's re-add this one. And we'll say its name is still latest value. And its key column is still my text. Tell it OK. And now we have a field whose value says test 5. There it is. But if I were to go back to the table and add a new row, let's say number 6, number 7, grade 8. Okay, so there they are. The latest value is grade 8. If we come back here to our table, sure enough, there it is. And it didn't fault because the key value remained the same. Little nuance there for when you're pulling data. There's much more that you can do with the RDBMS driver from Niagara. These are the key things to create histories, to create, to put your alarms out there, and also to pull data from the database. There are a couple of things that I want to point out from a troubleshooting standpoint. Before you start, we pinged the database. That was always a good plan. Make sure you know the correct port number. Make sure you choose the correct driver. We use the SQL Server driver to talk to the SQL Server database. Make sure everything is enabled. Make sure it's all in the right locations. You must have the correct login and password. Use the database logins and passwords, and that user must have access to the correct tables. Here's a good one, that SQL scheme enabled thing. If we had not enabled that, we would not have been able to read like we're doing here, where we're pulling in points. And then finally, if you ever run into any trouble, and often a good thing to do is to restart the station. Sometimes these things tend to not work the first time you try them. You can just spend hours trying to go through and figure out what you did wrong, only to find out that everything works fine if you restart the station. So if you ever have any problems, just try restarting the station. So that's how to use the Niagara RDBMS driver. Thank you very much for watching.